Hello, everyone. I'm going to be doing my presentation on zero tolerance policies, exclusionary discipline, and the ways that those push students out of education systems. The title of my presentation is School Interrupted: Restoring Educational Opportunity and Preventing School Pushout. So what I'll be covering in this presentation is first my problem outline and statement. I will then give a description of the organization that I work for. I will then give a general description of zero tolerance policies, after which I will discuss the interviews that I had with the staff members that I chose. Then I will discuss the findings in the literature that I reviewed and what solutions that I am proposing in light of those findings. So my original problem statement was that zero tolerance policies, and particularly the zero tolerance policy at Job Corps, excludes students from education and their training. It puts them at further risk for victimization and involvement with the justice system, both juvenile and criminal. And it does nothing to repair relationships or correct behavior. Not only that, zero tolerance engenders a culture of fear and breeds mistrust between students and staff, as well as further entrenching disidentification with school and education systems for students. So a brief description of Job Corps. It's a residential career training or vocational training program. It is funded by the Federal Department of Labor. So a common mistake that people make is that Job Corps is a school. It is not technically a school. It is not under the Department of Education, but it functions in many ways similar to a school. The particular center that I work at is named Hubert H. Humphrey Job Corps. It is in St. Paul, just north of the Midway on Snelling Avenue. Job Corps, the Hubert H. Humphrey Job Corps site is managed by a contracted corporation called Management and Training Corporation, or MTC for short. It's a residential program, so most students live on campus. They are between the ages of 16 and 24 when they enroll. And Job Corps uses zero tolerance philosophy as the basis for its behavior and discipline policies. Quick info on our student population. In order to qualify for the program, the student must meet eligibility requirements, including income level, disability, or homelessness, or being transient. The average student at Job Corps is male, Black, 19 years old, has not finished high school, comes from a densely populated urban area, and an impoverished home or living situation. Many of our students also have mental health issues, and students unfortunately have expressed that while they believe the program is a great opportunity because it is free, it does not feel any different or function any differently than schools that they have already been pushed out of. The extreme atmosphere of control and punitive responses to rule breaking are some of the problems that Job Corps students cite. Students, for example, are not allowed to leave campus even after the school day or on weekends without documented reasons. So they can't walk to the corner store, they can't go to Target to buy laundry detergent, none of that, at least on their own time. Students also must pass an initial drug test within the first week of enrollment, and a failure to do so will result in immediate de-enrollment from the program. So this is a description of zero tolerance policies in general, not necessarily specific to Job Corps. Zero tolerance is a philosophical approach to crime and violence prevention. It is not a step-by-step plan. It is partially based on broken window theory, which came out in the early 80s and was basically about the relationship between what were viewed as minor incidents like breaking windows and more serious violent crime. So broken window theory states that a strong reaction to minor crimes or behaviors is necessary to prevent larger, more catastrophic violence. And this strong response is supposed to also prevent future misbehavior or crime by essentially making people afraid to commit crimes, or in the case of students, afraid to break rules for fear of repercussions. So zero tolerance grew out of a fear of gun violence in schools in the late 80s and early 90s. President Bill Clinton signed the Gun-Free Schools Act of 1994 as a response to this fear. Originally, this piece of legislation banned firearms exclusively, but it has since been expanded to include any and all weapons and potential weapons. Job Corps' zero tolerance policy, of course, is not mandated by this Gun-Free Schools Act. It's actually mandated under a different code by the Department of Labor, but the philosophy behind it is still the same. The assumption is that zero tolerance creates a climate in schools that is more conducive to learning, one that's free of disruption and chaos and behavioral disruptions, so that teachers have more time to teach by removing, quote, troublemakers. So the interviews that I conducted with staff, there were 4 different staff I conducted interviews with. 2 of them were counselors who function a little bit like case managers, and also accountability staff. They're responsible for making sure students are following the attendance policies, that they're not racking up too many behavioral incidences, and they're also responsible for checking in with students just to see how they're doing in the program and monitoring their progress. The other 2 staff members that I interviewed were managers. One was an academic manager in charge of high school diploma and GED granting, and then a vocational training manager who manages all of the vocational training programs. In my interview with the staff members, there was a lot of overlap in how staff viewed the zero tolerance policies. Staff feel like zero tolerance is illogical because it either has a response that is way over what it needs to be, or it doesn't seem to be fair. It's reactive rather than proactive. It does nothing to prevent really behaviors that are problematic, and it is overreaching. Staff feel that positive relationships that they build and the trust that they have with students are better at preventing and mitigating behavior problems, and that zero tolerance actually undermines the relationships, the positive relationships that staff and students have. Staff understand also that different identities, such as race, gender, ability, and sexual orientation, affect students' access and experience in education, but they're not always able to articulate how those identities directly affect a student's experience or how they might make them vulnerable to exclusionary discipline. So here are my literature findings. The main points that I wanted to touch on are as follows. The overwhelming majority of the evidence from available research tends to contradict the assumptions that zero tolerance philosophy espouses. Zero tolerance and exclusionary discipline measures put Black students, students with disabilities, particularly emotional and behavioral disabilities, and LGBTQ+ students at heightened risk for educational exclusion. Zero tolerance policies and exclusionary discipline also increase the probability of those students' interactions with juvenile and criminal justice systems. So possibly to no one's surprise at this point, even though there's been 20 years of research, zero tolerance fails to live up to its own hype. The overwhelming majority of findings point to the fact that zero tolerance contradicts itself. There's an excerpt from the American Psychological Association's Zero Tolerance Task Force report, and it says, data on a number of indicators of school climate have shown the opposite effect of ZT's intention, ZT being zero tolerance, in creating better learning environments. That is, schools with higher rates of school suspension and expulsion appear to have less satisfactory ratings of school climate and spend a disproportionate amount of time on disciplinary matters. Rather than reducing the likelihood of disruption, school suspension in general appears to predict higher future rates of misbehavior and suspension. In the long term, school suspension and expulsion are associated with a higher likelihood of school dropout and failure to graduate, which in turn is associated with a higher likelihood of interaction with the justice system. Another quote, the introduction of zero tolerance policies has affected the delicate balance between the educational and juvenile justice systems. In particular, increasing schools' use of reliance on strategies such as security technology, security personnel, and profiling. This increased reliance on more severe consequences has also resulted in an increase of referrals to the justice system for infractions that were once handled in schools, for infractions that would not previously have been considered dangerous or threatening. So one of the challenges in researching the disproportionality in exclusionary discipline as represented in groups of students is that oftentimes sources or studies only use one variable in assessing impact on students. So one study might focus on race, one might study gender or sexual orientation, another on ability. And what these studies tend to miss is the ways that these identities and the experience of these identities are not, quote, the sum of their parts. One-dimensional analysis, for example, examining only race or gender, misses multi-dimensional identities that make some populations more vulnerable to the pipeline. Students with intersectional identities of race, gender, and disability are very vulnerable to the school to prison pipeline because in tandem with race, other intersectional identities can make a student more susceptible for removal from school. There's a quote here from Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw, who is kind of known as the creator or theoretical creator of the concept of intersectionality. Intersectionality is a lens through which you can see where power comes and collides, where it interlocks and intersects. It's not simply that there is a race problem here, a gender problem here, or a class or LGBTQ problem. Many times that framework erases what happens to people who are subject to all of these things. So in particular, we're looking at the impact on students of color with disabilities and LGBTQ plus students. Black students are consistently overrepresented in exclusionary discipline. Black male students are almost 3 times more likely than their white peers to receive exclusionary discipline. And Black females are disproportionately disciplined for subjective behaviors such as defiance, inappropriate dress, profanity, and aggressive behavior. The evidence that I examined shows that this disproportionality is not due simply to the economic disadvantage. So a lot of times people want to say it's not about race, it's about class. But that has been proven wrong, at least by the research that I've done. Nor is there any data that supports the assumption that Black students or children commit higher numbers of behavior infractions. So it's not that Black students misbehave more and that accounts for the disproportionality. Rather, Black students might be disciplined more severely for things that are less serious or more subjective. There's plenty of empirical evidence from psychology that shows that it might be due to lack of teacher prep in classroom management or lack of training in culturally competent practices. For example, that overrepresentation of Black female students it is sometimes coincides with the stereotypic image of African American girls and women as hostile, angry, and hypersexual. So the way that we choose to discipline Black female students is directly related to our implicit biases or society, or the policy's implicit bias. Students with learning disabilities, emotional behavior disorders, and other health impairments are more than twice as likely to receive exclusionary discipline as their non-disabled peers. Disabilities that typically function as a protective factor, so things like intellectual or developmental disabilities, do not function in this manner when it comes to Black students. So a Black student who has an intellectual disability is more likely to experience exclusionary discipline. The disparate impact of exclusionary discipline for students with emotional behavior disorders is even more pronounced. More than 44% of students diagnosed with EBD receive one or more suspensions, and students with disabilities who are already within the juvenile justice system are 30 to 60% of the entire delinquent population. And a lot of those students are academically, deficient or have experienced school failure. Female students of color with EBD are even more at risk for exclusionary discipline than male students with EBD. And again, this is in relation to their perceived violation of white, cis, feminine gender norms and expectations. With LGBTQ students, it's a little bit of a different lens. They are more likely to face exclusionary discipline due to sexist, anti-trans, or homophobic school policies like dress codes, bathroom usage, and policing of their romantic behaviors or sexual behaviors. Again, LGBTQ students of color are even more at risk for discipline compared to white LGBTQ plus students. LGBTQ plus students are more likely to face discipline for truancy in particular because of hostile school climate. So if we look at these statistics on the right here, almost 60% of LGBTQ students feel unsafe at school because of their sexual orientation. 42% of transgender and gender nonconforming students have been told that they cannot use their preferred names or pronouns, and 70% of LGBTQ plus students have experienced verbal harassment at school based on their sexual orientation. So nearly half of all students with non-cisgendered identities will experience exclusionary discipline through their school. Students who have reported having a disability, like an educational, emotional, or physical disability, are even more likely to experience school discipline if they identify both as LGBTQ and as having a disability. And LGBTQ plus youth are often punished even when they are the person harmed in bullying incidents, if they are the person reporting the bullying, including as a result of defensive violence. So one in 10 LGBTQ students who report incidents of victimization, their own victimization to schools, say that they themselves were disciplined as a result of that reporting. So now I'm going to talk about a couple of solutions that I am proposing. The first is PBIS, or Positive Behavior Intervention Systems. PBIS is an applied behavior analysis that uses a 3-tier system to intervene in student behaviors and kind of set up behavior norms within a school. It's implemented to provide growth and behavioral learning opportunities for students who are identified as needing extra behavioral support in education systems. So it's very similar to RTI. RTI is usually the academic counterpart, or the academic mirror to PBIS. So if we look at this pyramid illustration, the primary prevention tier is school-wide. That's where we establish behavior norms, usually something, a short list like be respectful, be safe, and be inclusive, or something small like that. And that's where we establish that school culture. Secondary prevention is more of that small group intervention. And then tertiary is, of course, individualized interventions. So data shows that where PBIS intervention systems are used, that there is a huge decrease in behavioral referrals. So teachers are referring students less to administration, as well as a decrease in suspensions and expulsions. Students and staff also have reported that the overall feeling or climate of safety improves in the school, and there is a reduction in bullying. PBIS also has been found to reduce problematic behaviors among students with second tier interventions, those small groups that focus on conflict resolution, development, social emotional development and development of social skills, and mentoring programs for students. So since I began my research, Job Corps has actually been looking into implementing PBIS at its centers, which is encouraging. The strength of PBIS is that it allows students the chance to learn new behaviors and new norms rather than punishing them and excluding them from learning. It also emphasizes documentation and monitoring the effectiveness of those interventions so that schools can assess how well they are truly implementing PBIS. Job Corps is an organization that's big on accountability and documentation, and so this solution I feel is and would be more accepted, readily accepted. It's data-based, it uses a behavioral analysis model, and so it's a little bit more what people would maybe label objective. And so I think that Job Corps as a government organization and as kind of almost, you know, from a bureaucratic perspective would take more readily to that. The second solution that I want to propose is the use of restorative justice. Restorative justice is a framework that is focused on the relationship between the person who has been harmed and the person who did the harming. Now, what I want to highlight is that it focuses on repairing and redeeming relationships, and it addresses the needs both of the person who did the harm and the person who was harmed. Because there is always a motivation for behavior, there is always a reason for behavior. There's a shift away from punitive language. And if we look at the graphic on the right, we can see that shift. So where zero tolerance focuses on guilt and punishment, restorative justice focuses on needs and responsibilities. So with zero tolerance, what we have is it is rooted in punishment. Excuse me. It focuses on the offense and the offender. It is aligned with the zero tolerance approach to school discipline, which we've espoused already. And punishments are exclusionary, like detention, suspension, expulsion. It takes students away from learning. It takes students away from their communities. Restorative justice, on the other hand, is rooted in reparations of harm. It focuses on that relationship, and it asks people who have done harm to acknowledge the harm and to also acknowledge their own needs along with the person who was harmed. So restorative justice enables students to have their needs met. Punitive systems like zero tolerance policies do not. They don't put students first. So rather than being labeled as a problem or a troublemaker, students can be seen as human beings with needs. It also focuses on relationships, which the staff members that I interviewed particularly have expressed as very valuable and something that needs to be invested in and used as a means to build effective discipline systems and as a way to, prevent problematic behavior. Restorative justice does not require policy change from Job Corps. It doesn't require the Department of Labor to mandate it. You can practice it in your classroom, in your school, and affect change right where you are. Ultimately, obviously, the hope is for zero tolerance to be lifted. But under the current circumstances, it is more realistic, in my opinion, to seek out solutions that can be implemented from the ground up. And so restorative justice enables teachers to do this in their classrooms and at their schools to affect systematic change. So that is the end of my presentation. I have lots of sources. I will let those play out for you guys. And if you guys have any questions, you can email me. Otherwise, thank you for listening, and I hope that you learned something.